Hello again everyone. Today we're going to have a go at painting a clematis. As you can see, I've drawn mine out ready to go, sketched onto watercolour paper with a 2B pencil. Now because this isn't going to be a botanical painting, but you can use a hot pressed paper if you want to get lots of details. You could use a hot pressed watercolour paper instead of your usual pad if you wanted to, but this paper that I'm working on isn't hot pressed, but it is £140 or 300 GM in weight as usual. When you're sketching your clematis, particularly if it's fairly pale colour, try and keep your pencil lines really light. If you go in a bit heavy-handed in the initial drawing, use a putty rubber and take the strength out of it. When you start the drawing, always go to the centre of the flower and place the centre of the flower where you want it to be on the page. If you're taking a photograph of a clematis of your own, or you are working from a photo, choosing a photograph to work from, or from observation, try to make sure that you photograph it not from straight on, otherwise you'll have the flower looking too flat. Slightly to the side, which you can see in my drawing, slightly to the side, so that will create a bit of shadow. I will have shadows to go around here eventually, and some shape to the leaves. Otherwise, if you photograph it from flat on, all you'll get is a very sort of something that's not very three-dimensional at all. When you're drawing, go from that central shape and start with the petals. Think a bit about it like hands on a clock. Go for a petal at 12 o'clock, one sort of at 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock, roughly speaking, and then fill the petals in between, and that way you'll get the correct spacing. And also look at the distance from the petals from the centre of the flower to the tip, and look at how they change. They're not uniform, and so you can get different lengths. Some will be much shorter and perhaps curled over. This particular clematis has got several rows of petals, so that's what I did. Start with the first row, then move on to the next row, and finally the largest petals on the outside. And as you can see, I've got some petals which are much wider and others which are much shorter, so you need to really observe, but do your pencil sketching lightly first. Once your drawing's completed, work out your palette of colours for your specific clematis. The one that I'm painting, this is my colour selection. I'm going to start off with using a very diluted wash for the centre of the flower of Aureolin and Windsor Blue. Most of the first set of petals are this pale lilac, and I've chosen Windsor Blue and Permanent Rose, loads of water to make it very pale, and then there'll be shades in between. So again, you can see I've skipped to a much darker mix of the same colour combination, much less water, and I'll have all sorts of shades in between those two. I'll be using Permanent Rose on its own, again mixed to different strengths to touch in, because each petal is going to be treated wet in wet. And then I've also introduced another pink. Now this one is called Quinacridone Magenta. It's like a really strong, shocking pink, and I can use that in its very strongest mix for some of the outer petals, but I will be combining it with this Windsor Blue Quinacridone Magenta mix, and there's variations that I've been trying out to get a really strong colour. So I will be using these two together for the outer petals, along with some of the other mixes with the Windsor Blue and Permanent Rose. But obviously, depending upon the clematis that you've chosen, your colour combinations are going to be different. And these are not the only way I could get this particular flower. You've got to use what you have in your own box. Now that my colours are mixed in advance, I'm going to start with the centre of the flower, which is this pale colour combination. So I'm going to use a size 4 brush. Oh, actually no, I might go a little bit bigger. I think this is a size 6, and the colour is very diluted, and I can basically wash this over the entire centre of the flower, more or less. But if I do it fairly quickly, what I'll be able to do is then just lift off any areas which I want to be slightly lighter, so I can be fairly generous with my colour and get this down quite quickly. pick up a little bit of water, and then what I'm going to do is fade that colour out, because there's a little bit of reflected light on the underside. So if I've just got clean water on my brush, I can merge that quite nicely so there's no hard line, and I can fade out the colour on this front piece here, just so there's a hint of colour, and exactly the same on this section as well. Keep washing your brush off to lift your colour away. And then I'll just get a little hint of green appearing. Okay. Now if there's any other areas where you think you want to have a catch of light before it has a chance to dry, just use a bit of a damp brush and lift off any other sections. So this way you'll get a soft effect. So I'm wiping the excess colour off on some kitchen paper so that it's not a totally flat wash, it's slightly mottled. So, and I think that's easier to do than trying to paint each individual sort of petal on that inside section, just lifting off afterwards. Obviously if it's a warm day you have to move fairly quickly, but I get a little bit of variation this way. And then I just have to stop and let that dry before I go on to anything else. While this is drying, I've got my extremely pale mix for the next set of petals. Now obviously if this central part is still wet, I can't apply that colour, but as soon as that's dried I can then wash this really, really pale, very, very diluted mauve over the petals. Now there may be some areas where you want the colour to be the white of the paper. I'm going to just use a bit of clean water, and I'm actually just going to fade it off so that I get some very, very light parts of the petals. And again, same technique as the centre of the flower. You can always use some clean water and just lift away. So these ring of petals that are around that central section are going to be so pale but not totally white. One petal at a time. Don't try and do more than one at a time, because you won't get the opportunity to soften your edges. So I'm just using a little bit of clean water and introducing a hint of colour around the edge of the petal. And that will dry very, very light, but again, damp brush just in the centre so I get some variation. And I'm going to do that with all of the petals that are close to that sort of centre part with that same technique all the way round. Now that I've completed the palest set of petals around that sort of centre of the flower, I did also, just while some of those pale lilacs were still wet, I touched a little bit of permanent rose into them just to vary the colour very, very slightly. But that's it, that's now dry, and I'm going to concentrate on the centre petals that are still furled up. So I need to go in with a really small brush. This is a size 2, and I'm just going to up the amount of green on some of the petals. So I'm just going to put a tiny touch of colour on and then use water, just clean water, to fade that colour out a little bit. So I'm not painting over every single sort of frond, and I'm not putting any of the strong shadows in at this stage. I just want to accentuate a little bit of colour on parts of those fronds, so I'm using a tiny brush. I won't do this on every single one, just pick out a few where I think that the colour needs to be a little bit stronger. It may even be that I've added a little bit of gamboge, so a slightly stronger yellow, and again just using water to fade that out. And this should just make the fronds curl round a little bit more and accentuate, so it's where the sunlight's catching. So sometimes a stronger mix of the green and sometimes just a little bit more of the yellow tone. And I'm going to work my way round one frond at a time off of a tiny brush, putting a stripe of colour down and then picking up water and just fading that in with water so that I can control what I'm doing. So a little line of colour and then water on the brush. So I'm not repainting every frond, but I'm just working a little bit more tone. I'm not doing the darkest ones either, I'm just picking out some of the ones where I think colour needs to be strengthened on parts of it. So come round with a bit of stronger colour, wash the brush off and clean water, and then I can just fade that across. So I'll work my way round doing that to all of the fronds, and then when it's dry I can come back and just put some of the little pieces of dark shadow in between. But I need to get this section done first so that I have got a dry base to do that on. This one down the front here has got a little bit of grey, so I've just used a touch of mixed a neutral, or any other mixed grey would be fine, and I just want to put a little bit of grey in there, and again water on the brush and pull it across. If the colour puddles, just use the brush like a mop, and then while that's wet there's a touch of yellow that I want to just bring in just to warm it slightly, and above it a little bit of the pale green. So again I can do a little line of green and then water on the brush and merge it. So you're working one at a time, don't try and do multiple, because this way you can control and do mini wet in wet. In fact, while that grey is still slightly damp, I'm just going to touch a little bit of the mauve in to make the shadow a bit more interesting and just let it bleed across on its own. And I can do that on all of the ones in the bottom section here, because you're getting some definitely sort of blue-grey shadows on those sections. So I'm going to do that on all of the ones at the bottom. Once that's dry, I'll come back in and put the darkest shadows in. Now that I've finished sort of upping the colour saturation in that central bit, I'm just going to use a really small brush, a 0, and I'm going to go in and put a few very sort of deep, almost like olivey greens, just to get a little bit of shadow being cast on that central section. You can do this now. I'm going to do this now. You could leave this till later when you start putting shadows on other sections, but I'm going to put it in place now, and hopefully that will mean the shape of this central section will begin to make more sense. So I'm using a really small brush, and I'm just going to put in some very tiny dark bits of shadow on the tip of the petal, and then it casts a little bit of shade over the flower. So we're only talking tiny sections, which is why I'm using such a small brush, and move one petal at a time down, actually getting some shadow here being cast by a petal that we haven't painted into very much yet, but I might as well get the shadow in place at this stage. And it gets cast right the way across. And then I'll dip into water because the shadow fades out. So it comes all the way around. Now that won't make a huge amount of sense now, but it will when we get on to the next tone on the next set of flowers. So I'm just going to come in and carry on with these bits of shadow. And hopefully what will start to happen is it will begin to lift some of the petals as they're starting to unfurl from the centre. I don't want to make it too dark, otherwise it'll look stripy, but just enough. I am going to use a little bit of water just to soften some of the edges. It's quite warm in here, so it's drying quite quickly, so I have to be a bit careful. And little bits of darker straight into water. And wash it in with a bit of water. So this is the shadows that are being cast. And again, just softening it out. Not everywhere, but in some places, just needs to work in a little bit. You can always come back and do these darker if you realise that you haven't gone in strong enough. There's quite a major bit of shadow down here, so I want to come in very carefully in and out of the shape of these petals. And then into water and pull the colour across. And then I can move on to the other side. And the dark shadow should really have an impact and help with the 3-dimension of your flower centre. Straight into water. Into the centre of the flower. This is a really strong shadow that runs right through the middle. Much wider. And again, a little bit of water just to fade the shadow out at the bottom. So there's little touches of this right the way round, so I've just got to do small bits right the way round, and then that's more or less the centre done. Right at the end of the painting you can always review that and see if you need to do any more. Now we're going to start to darken or put in some of the shadows on this first set of petals around the central section. So I'm just going to be using sort of bluey mauves off of a fairly small brush, using my mix of mauve and Windsor blue, get a little bit of variation going, and we'll start putting in some of the shadows. So I will begin at the top and work my way round, getting some of these shadows in place. Now you might want to put a shadow in and then drop another colour into it as you go round. Some of the shadows are going to be more of a pink tone than others, so I'm going to vary it as I work from side to side, and these shadows are generally sharp edged, so I'm working onto dry paper and having a nice crisp edge to the shadows. So this is off of a small brush, and vary it as it comes round. But while that's still wet, if you want to, you can touch a little bit of colour variation in. So I could touch just a little bit of pink in there. Oh, it's so warm in here, that's already dried. So I'll just use a bit of water to move it round. And then go on to the next shadow. So one at a time, working my way around. I'm still not going on to the biggest petals. I'm just trying to concentrate on these. Now this particular petal is, I've got to get shadow going through the centre of it, get more shape in it. So I'm going to run a line through, then immediately pick up water and start to pull some of the shadows up onto the petal above, or the upper half of the petal I should say. So strengthening the colour, but not going over the whole thing. There are parts of it still paler, so I can use water all the time. It's water to soften edges and move the colour around. And then I can touch more colour in while that's wet. So it's mini wet in wet really. That's what you're trying to achieve. And I'm pulling the brushwork round to try and follow the curve of the flower. I will soften some edges. You can use the brush to lift colour off if you want to, and then I need to come down onto the lower petal because the shadow there is very sharp and crisp. So I can run it through there. There's a tiny bit more at the top edge. You can then see how that dries, and if you need to go back stronger, you can go back stronger. If you've gone too strong on anything, then just use the brush to pull away some colour and wipe your brush off on a piece of kitchen paper. So if the colour's spread too far, I need a little bit of light picking up on parts of that. I can just pull that up. And again, if there's colour variation, so you might have a bit of pink or whatever your petal is, I can drop a little bit of colour in, and again just use water to soften in my edges. So I'm starting to get the tone. Now I need to move round because that petal is overlapping ones underneath. So back to my mauve again with a nice sharp edge and start coming round, looking at how the shadow is being cast on the petal below. And hopefully this will mean that you begin to get one petal overlapping another and some three-dimension coming through in the flower. Keep looking all the time. I've got to see how strong these dry as to whether or not I'm going to have to come back and do any of it again, but it's looking okay so far. And then I can come down. So I'm just working one petal at a time, otherwise you'll get confused where you are. So I'm coming down, moved up to a bigger brush because I want to carry more liquid, and looking at the way the shadow varies as it goes across the petal. So I can pick up some water and wash the shadow in. It's not as solid all the way across the petal, and it blurs out in places. So again, picking up some water and softening an edge, but keeping the rest of it sharp. Got a little bit of cauliflower there, that's okay. Drop in a bit more stronger on this side. And then there's back to my smaller brush because there's some shadow at the tip of the petal here. So always swapping up and down the size of your brushes that you're working with. I keep them all in my hand so that I can just move from one to the other as I need to. And again, water on the brush. Paler bits of shadow down on the tip. In fact, I will bring in a little bit of pink, I think, at this point, just very diluted pink. And again, move that round with the brush, washing it in so that it doesn't start to get too stripy. So I'm going to go all the way round that first set of petals, building these shadows up. Now we're at a point where we can start working on the petals towards the back of the painting. So I'm going to begin by putting the lightest colour down again first. I've got everything ready. I've got a pale lilac very watered down. I've got my stronger quinacridone magenta, which is that shocking pink, and then I've got sort of a range of mauves in between, all ready to go. So again, beginning with the lightest purple, the very watery one, I'm going to start with the petal at the back here, and my aim is to work quickly enough that I can then drop other colours into this light mauve. So if things dry too fast, because it is really warm in here, I will have to re-wet with clean water. So don't panic if after you've put your wash down it's dried too far for you to drop other colours into it. Just let it dry totally and then re-wet with clean water so that you can then drop your colours in. So that's already beginning to dry over here in this section, so I'm just going to use a bit of water. If I wet the whole of the petal first, which you can of course do, you just have a little less control over where your colours are going to go. So I'm going to start by dropping some of my, this is actually permanent rose. I've just got it on the tip of the brush, a fairly strong mix, so that I can drop it in to this central part of the petal. So this is permanent rose, and I'm going to let that bleed towards the outside of that particular petal, and then immediately, because it is so warm, I can't afford to let things dry. This is quinacridone magenta, so this is a strong mix of quinacridone magenta, which is a very bright pink. You may not have these colours, you just have to work with what you've got. If you've got permanent rose, then a strong mix of permanent rose to give you a slightly more brilliant colour, and I'm just going to load that in just with the tip of the brush and let that bleed across, and leave that, apart from there's a slight lightening just in the centre, so I can use my damp brush just to pull back again that central, just a little bit before it has a chance to dry. Then I need to be patient and let that dry, although it has crept a bit further than I wanted just on the edges, so I'm going to use some clean water and lift a touch of the colour there, use my kitchen paper to just blot away. There we go. Just where it's run a little bit too far. Okay, now I've got the other side of that petal to do, and into this gap. So again, a little bit of the mauve, which I can move around, and that becomes my base. Soften those edges with a little touch of water. And then permanent rose, I'm just going to use the tip of the brush, so bleed in a tiny bit of permanent rose, soften that with a bit of water. Okay, we'll leave that. I'm going to move on to this one behind. So again, exactly the same idea, in with my lilac to start with. Just a touch, because this is very pale. So lilac down, use water to soften it in, and this becomes then the wet petal that you drop other colour into. So again, lilac down, and this time I'm going to go straight in with the magenta because it's really strong colour. So I'm going to just drop the magenta in and just keep feeding it in and letting it move and bleed out, just touching it with the tip of the the brush and sharpen the edge of the petal. In and out against the other one. Okay, and then what I need to do is have a slightly thicker mix of that same colour, so the quinacridone magenta, but just not so watered, so that I can drop that into the middle and it will move, but not so far. It's a thicker mix, so it will move around, but a little bit more slowly, and we'll see how that dries. So I'm going to do exactly the same. Last petal I'm going to show you is this one over here, because there's an even deeper colour in there. So again, the purple wash, which I can put in, it's quite pale on this side, so very watered down on this side, lots of water, move that around. And then as you come round, it's a bit stronger on this top section, so I've picked up a slightly stronger mix, and I'm being quite careful to make sure I have an interesting outer edge to the petal, and then again using water to move that in before it has a chance to dry, and come right in with this. And then in the centre I've got a alizarin crimson mix, which I'm just going to touch in. It's alizarin crimson, and again I've put a bit of the Windsor blue in with that to make it a duller, deeper colour. And I just need to bring that in and let it bleed across. And I'm going to introduce a tiny bit of my permanent rose just on the edge. In fact, I'll strengthen the mix up a bit so it's slightly thicker. Touch that along the edges. And then I can go back to my maroon mix of colour, drop some more in and let it bleed across. And I might even put a tiny bit of that very dark purple just in the centre and let that bleed across. So this is all sort of like mini wet in wet on one petal. And we'll see how that dries. I'm going to do the same to all the other outer petals using those same combination of colours and see how strong they dry. If they dry too light, I can re-wet them with clean water and I can go back in and drop more colour in. I've spent a considerable amount of time working on the petals, building up with exactly the same as I did for the top three, those same combination of colours, keep feeding in the colour, wet in wet, and then putting the darker, more maroony shadow on when the petal was dry. The other thing that I've also done, having built the colour up on those sections, I realised that the colour of the shadow around this central part wasn't quite dark enough, so I've just put a thin wash of Windsor blue over the top of the colour that I had down there, and have brought a little bit of it up into the bottom of those petals there to make it a little bit more three-dimensional. So I'm pretty happy with the centre of the flower now, so I'm going to concentrate on the leaves and a little bit of stem. I've picked leaves and put them where I want them to be to make what I consider to be a pleasing arrangement. Now I'm going to set my clematis against white paper, but of course the option is always there to put a wash around the clematis. It is quite a complicated shape to do that, so that you might well get some hard edges forming if you don't work extremely quickly. So I'm going to leave mine against white paper and just build up some petals, some leaves around the petals. So I've mixed 3 shades of green and I'm going to go in with the lightest first. I'm not going to do a huge amount of detail in these petals. I just want to get a little bit of greenery to foil the plant. So I'm going to load the brush with the lightest green, which is actually a fairly strong mid-green. I'm still working with exactly the same combination of colours that I have used so far, which is the gamboge, which is my yellow, plus a little bit of the Windsor blue. So I'm sticking with a fairly limited palette actually, but it's all down to the strength of the colour that I'm putting in. I have also got some aureolin, which is that much lighter yellow, ready so that I can drop a little bit of that in. Now I'm going to need to do this all at once, so I'm going to get some of the gamboge, some of the aureolin, and drop it into this mix so that I get a bit of variation on the colour. So just drop that in. Any colour that accumulates, don't forget, you just mop up excess colour that you don't want. And before it has a chance to dry, I'll just take that stalk and have that disappear away. But I'm going to do one leaf at a time so that I can work a little bit sort of wet in wet. I've got a deeper green, so I've added a little bit of burnt sienna into this, and I'm just going to drop a little bit of deeper green in. As I say, I'm not going to do a huge amount of detail in these leaves, I just want to get varying tones on the underside, the back, and I will have to leave this to dry before I can do any more, so I'm just dropping this in. And again, I'm just going to mop up the excess colour. This is my sort of base. I'm going to let that dry and then move on to the next colour. So once that first one's dried, so while that's drying, I can go on to the next leaf, put my basic mid-tone green down. You don't have to put any leaves in. I would suggest you put a stalk in because it looks a little bit odd if it's sort of decapitated, but I think the green of the leaves will foil it, but I'm just putting the leaves where I want them to be. This is my much darker mix. In fact, I've dropped a little bit of the purple I used in the flowers into this, and I'm just going to touch that in and let it just flow down the leaf to put that into the shade a little bit. I can't do this other leaf until that first one's dried, so I'm going to go onto the sort of stem, if you like, and this I'm going to go straight in with a really dark green because it is actually in the shade. So I've got that dark green, which is my basic mix, gamboge and Windsor blue. The Windsor blue I've been using is actually red shade, and I've put a little bit of the purple in, so I just want a hint that there's stalk coming through. If you find it too awkward, this brush has got a pretty good point to it, but you can always change to a smaller brush that's got a good point, which is in fact what I'm going to do to add on a little bit more colour to this. I'm going to go down to a small brush with the good point and the slightly lighter green. I'm just going to introduce that down one side, and I'm going to have the stem just fading off, I think, rather than anything else. Just fade it away. But I do need to make sure that I'm cutting it, the stem in, so it looks as though everything is joined together. So my smaller brush will allow me to go right in tight. I'll pick up some yellow and I'm just going to touch a bit of yellow in. Don't forget, if you're adding wet in wet, your mix must be fairly thick or you'll get cauliflowers appearing. I'm just going to run a little bit of yellow onto that dark green. Makes it a bit more interesting while it's still wet. So I need to let this all dry before I can work on that last petal. So I have got a last leaf, I should say. I have got a leaf on the right hand side which I'm going to work on. So again, back to my larger brush and the lightest green, and I'm going to work into this one on this side, just so there's a bit of balance to the composition. I'll then look at the whole thing once it's finished, and I can make a decision, do I need to add any more foliage in? Because I'm putting the foliage in to make a pleasing arrangement, not because that's how it is in my photographic reference, but because I want to place it. I'm using the genuine leaves from it, but I'm moving them slightly to make an arrangement that I like. So again, I'm going in with my lightest green first, which is this fairly strong mid-tone, and then while that's still wet, vary the greens, drop them in, and this could be all you want to do with the leaves, or if you wish you can come back and when this base wash has finished you could add a little bit more detail. I'm actually going to drop in a bit of yellow towards the top, I think, to get a bit of variation. Back to my mid-tone green. Right. Cauliflowers might form, but don't forget you can always go, if it bothers you, you can go in and look at that again. I can now come back to this last one here because everything around it's dried. So again, I can put my lightest green down with my bigger brush. This is my size 8 brush. Get as close to everything as I can with that, and then move down to a smaller brush to go right into the edges. So load your brush with plenty of colour. Don't be mean about the puddles of colour that you've mixed, especially if you're working in a warm environment, because it will dry really fast, as you can see. So I can now move to my smaller brush and cut in carefully, and this is the quickest way to get the wash down, but I want to make sure I've got really good interesting shape profile, so I'm using a small brush just to make sure that my leaf shape is good, and then before it has a chance to dry, a bit of variation. So this is going into the shade, so I need to get some darker greens on here. A little touch of really deep green, I think. Now, I don't like the way that that stem overlaps here, so I think what I'm going to do is go across and alter the shape of the leaf slightly. Pick up a little bit of lighter tone and bring it through. Back to my darker green. Actually, I'll go in with an even smaller brush and I can get a really sharp edge. That's better. The overlap is better now. I'm going to go back to the leaf on top and do a second darker part of that, and use some water just to fade it in. Okay, now lastly go to this first leaf that we began with. It's dried and I want to get some shadow on the underside So back in with my deeper greens. I'm stopping to load my brush. Just want to make this look as though it's going round the corner. And down into the stem area. So I'll have a little bit of shadow on the underside of the stem. Just making sure my hands are clean so I'm not putting right. Back to a little bit of a fold on this leaf. And finally the last leaf on the right, I'll do exactly the same to that one and have a bit of shadow underneath the stem. So I know I could put a lot more detail in the leaves, and of course you can if you wish, but I'm just going to use the leaves to foil my flower, and I think I need to just soften that line there a little bit. So overall I need to look and see if I need to add any more. I can always add some more leaves if I think it's necessary. You can put a background in it if you wish. Check your tones, make sure that you've got strong enough shadow around the centre of your clematis. Look at the light and shade, the way it's falling. Have you got one petal looking like it's in front of another? Do you need to go back and darken anything? So just review everything that you've done. But basically, I think my painting is more or less finished. I may consider putting another leaf or two in, but let it dry and have a look and see if you need to adjust your tones. But really, that's it.